Hello everyone, thank you so much for joining us this morning. I'm Catherine Stanyland, I'm one of the directors at New London Architecture and delighted that so many of you have joined us this morning for the launch of Zero Carbon London, which is NLA's new research that looks at how London can get to net zero. We have over 650 people registered today, which is fantastic, and just goes to show how important this issue is to London and to the profession. Zero Carbon London you can download from the NLA website now. It looks at what London is doing to get to net zero, highlights the key initiatives and projects that are happening across the city, and also looks at the main barriers and solutions to getting there. And we're going to be looking at those in the session today. Our research is the result of months of roundtables and events and sessions with the industry, as well as a survey of the NLA membership. And our survey told us that 85% of respondents said that the current policy and regulations are not fit for purpose to get to net zero, and that we should be prioritising retrofit over rebuild. And we're delighted to be announcing our support of the AJ's Retro First campaign, and we'll be working together over the coming months on this really important issue. Of course, at a global level, the recent projected outcome of the US election is likely to put the climate emergency right at the top of the agenda. And the UK is going to be hosting the UN summit next year, COP26, which gives us the opportunity to make some really leading commitments as a nation. And we expect to see a 10-point plan from central government over the next few weeks. At the London level, we have the mayoral elections taking place in May next year. So we have just a few months remaining to tell our mayoral candidates what we want them to prioritise for London. Today's event is part of the NLA's year-round Zero Carbon programme. And thank you to all of our champions for supporting that. Elementa, Hain Tillett Steel, Hawley, London and Partners, Miele and Waterman Group. I'd also like to thank Ruth Slavid for working with us on the research, our expert panel on net zero for guiding and supporting the work, and our members who've taken part in our survey and shared their projects with us. So today, we're going to hear from a series of experts from the industry to provide their perspectives on the solutions and the barriers for London to get to net zero. And after all of their contributions, we will go to a Q&A from the audience. So please do pose your questions throughout the event, and you can use the Zoom Q&A function to do so. And I'll try to get to as many as I can by the end. But first, I'm going to hand over to Barbara Casey of the NLA, who runs our Net Zero programme, and she's going to give a brief overview of the research and its findings. So Barbara, over to you.
Thanks, Catherine. So I'm going to present the findings of our report today. And as you said, the report asks where London is in the roadmap to zero carbon, and in particular, how the built environment sector is responding to tackle the climate emergency. It is based around a survey that we did with the NLA membership in September, asking what were the key barriers and solutions for London to get to net zero, and includes insights from roundtable discussions and meetings of the NLA expert panel on net zero, which is a group of London's built environment professionals leading on London's climate agenda. It also includes a showcase of over 80 exemplar projects that push the bar of environmental design from retrofits to new builds to master plans and toolkits. Now, on the next slide, before I present the key findings of our survey, I want to take a step back and just sort of give a little bit of a context of why this matters. So if you see, cities globally account for 70% of carbon emissions, and they are responsible for consuming 2/3 of the world's energy. Currently, they are home to 5.6 billion people. And so this means that if all cities can reduce their climate impacts, then we can really make good progress to address the climate emergency. When looking at the biggest source of emissions in cities, we have buildings that account for, on average, around 55%, followed by transport, around 1/3, in particular road transportation, and then processing waste, it's normally around 10%. So this is why our industry is really important in addressing the climate emergency. Now, if you go on the next slide, I'm going to present the findings of our survey, and we received 178 responses from professionals from across 105 different organizations. Companies were from different sectors. However, the majority are from architecture, consultancy, and engineering. And this means that perhaps the responses are a bit more representative of these sectors in our survey. On the next slide, we ask, the first question is whether our respondents think that climate change was important to them, and then we ask the same question about how they feel about their organizations taking on the climate issue. And as you can see, 99% of our respondents says that climate change is either very important or generally important. And for their climate, for their organization, that's around 87%. So although this is certainly very encouraging to see, I think that's still a gap that we can see on how companies are behaving to address climate change as opposed to what it means for individuals' values. On the next slide, and to support this point, we can see that there's a lot of commitments that are coming out from our industry. And 99 out of 105 companies that took part in our survey have either signed up to one of the industry pledges or set their own climate commitment. So that's a really positive sign that we can see. On the next slide, we ask whether our respondents think that the UK government is able to meet the climate agenda, the climate targets by 2050, and ask the same questions about London. And as you can see, only 2% believe that the UK is on track to meet the climate agenda, and 20% saying somewhat. And this is only marginally improved for London, where we have a 3% saying yes and 31% saying somewhat. We also ask if London should be more ambitious in their climate agenda and bring forward the climate targets, and actually 60% saying that we should have a 2030 deadline, and this should be on the agenda for the next mayor. So a good point to kind of put forward. On the next slide, so we ask our sector what to rank the biggest barriers for London to achieve the zero carbon targets, and we ask them to rank them from less challenging to most challenging. And as you can see, the #1 barrier has been voted as the policy and regulation. There is a concern that the policy framework and regulation are not fit for purpose, and they're not really helping in getting us to net zero. The second most rated barrier is the lack of green finance. And so the transition to a low carbon economy is not supported by adequate investment, and the current financial models are not really taking into account climate risk. The third most rated barrier is the lack of common standards and shareable data, and this is particularly around disclosing carbon emissions, using reliable measuring tools that are comparable and that the industry can use to benchmark the progress. The fourth most rated is time and scale, and this is a point around understanding that even if we know what to do, we really don't have much time to act, and the scale is huge. We have to adopt all the solutions across all of London to really have sort of an impact. The fifth most rated is working together. This is a point perhaps on the lack of integration across different sectors, and an understanding that addressing the climate emergency requires an effort from everyone. It can't be done in isolation. And on the last 2 points, we have lack of skills and lack of knowledge that are coming out as not huge barriers for the sector. However, we must say that this is a point that has been raised many times, and the carbon literacy is still a huge gap, and it has to be sort of put out there beyond the sustainability professionals. So that's something that we should always sort of put at the forefront. And on this point, on the next slide, we ask our respondents whether if they knew what to do in their job to support London to achieve its climate targets. And again, quite positively, we have 69% that says that they pretty much know what to do. However, there's also a good proportion that they might not know necessarily. And on this point, we asked what they needed the most to help them. And 42% said they wanted clearer direction from the industry. And this is followed by 24% that says they need more time allocated in their job to focus on these issues, and 60% saying they need more training, with 80% say they need other things. Now, on the next slide, and this is to support the point about the policy being rated as the most challenging, our respondent said 85% agree with the statement that the current policy framework and regulations are not fit for purpose and they're not compatible with zero carbon targets. And this is to strengthen the point that is coming out from our survey, that there is more to be done to address the lack of consistencies and commitments from across different policy areas. Now, on the next slide, I am going to say a bit of the positive side of things, so the solutions that exist up there. And again, we ask our respondents to rank these solutions from the ones that will have the less impact to the ones that will have the most impact. And as you can see, the solutions that have been voted to have the most impact is retrofitting to become 90% of the work of the built environment professionals. This is followed by the adoption of a truly circular economy approach to construction, design, and planning. And the third most rated action that will have the most impact is a transition to 100% clean energy. This is followed by design and building new buildings to be zero carbon in operation, followed by adoption of a whole life carbon assessment. The second to last is design and build all new buildings to be close to zero embodied carbon, and then finally increasing green infrastructure. I want to add that in the comments that we received on the survey, many people actually said that we should do all of them, and it's really, really hard to rank them in order, but still, this is quite significant. On the next slide, we ask a similar question. So we ask to actually rate the same actions, but in order of what is most possible to implement in the next 5 years to what is less possible. And most possible to implement is the adoption of whole life carbon assessment. The second most possible action is to increase green infrastructure. And then in order, we have design and building to be zero carbon in operation, design and build buildings to be zero embodied carbon. And then on the last 2 points is the adoption of a circular economy approach, retrofitting to become 90% of the work of built environment professionals, and finally a transition to 100% clean energy. So I think, as you can see, the last 3 points are considered to be more difficult to implement in the next 5 years, but from the previous slide, they were the ones that were considered to be the most impactful. And so perhaps there is a need to accelerate those solutions, but equally we can see that there are other things that we can get going on right now. So that's again quite significant. On the next slide, we also wanted to have an understanding of what were the implications of the COVID-19 crisis on the climate agenda. And quite positively, we have 91% of our respondents that says that the COVID-19 crisis could be actually an opportunity to transform our economy and our cities to be more environmentally sustainable. So again, that's quite an interesting point there. And then on the final slide, just to sum up some of the key messages that we have in our reports, is that London has some ambitious policies in place. 27 out of 33 London local authorities have declared a climate emergency. The built environment sector is showing leadership, but there are still many barriers that needs to be addressed. And the key priorities are addressing the policy gap and provide more funding to help the transition. the solutions already exist. There is perhaps a will from the industry to be a bit more radical in changing the sector, and this is, quite evident in the respondents of backing the retrofit approach. So finally, we also want to sort of push ahead on making sure that the recovery from COVID-19 is really prioritize the green economy, and that the built environment sector should play a key role in that recovery. So this is the end of the presentation, and I'm looking forward to answer any questions later on.
Thank you very much, Barbara. And I see quite a few people have joined us in the last few minutes, so welcome to all of you. And just a reminder that you can pose questions throughout the event using the Zoom Q&A function. So please do so, and we'll get to those at the end. I'm now delighted to introduce Sunan Prasad, who is the new chairman of UK GBC and took up post just last month. And we've asked Sunan to respond to this point on policy and regulation not being fit for purpose and give us his view on the key sticking points and the opportunities ahead to make this align much better. So Sunan, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you, Barbara, for that gallop through what is a very full and dense and very readable report. So congratulations to the NLA in, as ever, keeping us informed and stimulated. And let's plunge in. It's noticeable that, and you've underlined it, that of course the responses are primarily from consultants. And so when we talk about the industry, we still aren't quite really talking about the industry. I don't know how many contractors and specialists and subcontractors were involved, because the industry, if the industry actually spoke with a more united voice, we would definitely get much further on this. So I think that within the industry, and I think every consultant will recognize this, we're not really that yet as joined up as we need to be to really make a difference. So before going on to talk about the regulations and why we need better policy and regulation, I want to just underline that in a way, part of the answer is in our hands. It's actually to unite this industry. And we know from everyday experience of working on jobs and pushing the zero carbon agenda that there is a lot of not necessarily active resistance, but sort of passive, almost apathy and a fear of costs, which actually are huge barriers on a daily level. I mean, we would like every one of our buildings to be zero carbon and go all out to do that right now, but it's not that easy, given that we have to work collectively and so on. Anyway, onwards from the rant, it's actually part of the same thing, that because I think as a group, consultants aren't feeling that powerful nowadays. There was a time in history when being a consultant architect, you felt that you actually had influence and power. And it's, I think, a symptom of that we think that regulations and policy, we ask for that and say, that's the main thing. And in a way, that is sort of a cry of the powerless as well, to say that. But of course, it's true. It doesn't make it any less true, but let's bear that in mind. Because as many of your respondents said, it's not about choosing these various measures. It is all of them together. And I would particularly like to think how they relate. So policy and regulations, green finance, and all the other things. The way they would relate is actually, and this is one thing I think we can ask for, is what's the path? What is the path? Let's just for a moment suspend whether it's 2030, 2040, or 2050, whatever the date is, what is our collective path as a country? And of course, then as cities, regions, districts, and so on, what is the collective path to that zero carbon future? And, the much used word route map, there was to be a zero carbon route map in 2007 and 8, when, we first had the upsurge of a response to the climate. That zero carbon route map has never really become real. And, you know, and personally, I don't quite, understand why. It's because very often what happens is that the best becomes the enemy of the good. So people think that the zero carbon route map has to solve every problem and deal with every situation and fit it all together. It doesn't have to do that. A great example of a route map was the Code for Sustainable Homes. What it said was, it set a target. It said by 2016, by the way, it was going to be all homes were going to be zero carbon. And then we were going to get to it in steps. There was going to be a code 3, 4, 5, 6, eventually the building regs. There was a path laid out. It was at that time a 9-year path, I think, at least 8-year path. And you could see what the incremental changes were going to be. And the industry actually did respond. There was no part of the industry that actually said, no, we're not going to do this. And then unilaterally, the coalition government abolished that. You know, that is the kind of shameful, terrible legacy that we have of a government actually going back, you know, after 2010 on so many policies, which were actually quite good policies. So I would very much say that the way to bring these things together, of course, yes, we have to have the right regulations. Regulations need context. The green finance, you know, one of the big problems, of course, with climate change and why it's a market failure is that the market is unable to plan for the 50, 100-year horizon. And the only way to deal with that is through understanding the relationship between long-term costs and short-term expense. And the way to relate that is through finance. So all these things do fit together. Route map's the only way. I'm very glad that you mentioned carbon literacy and skills and so on, because I think that we often think that the knowledge and skills are the knowledge and skills of the industry and of professionals, but I think we need to have this literacy in the population. I think that, you know, just the way people talk about house prices with complete expertise, they ought to be able to understand energy costs, you know, and those numbers with at least half that expertise. Can I just say one final thing about COVID? Which is that I think, obviously, we all think and we know that COVID is actually part of the same syndrome as climate change. You know, it's our attitude towards the world and the earth and nature that has caused this. But and we should not let it. We should actually see it as a warning and what could happen with climate change impacts. But it does pose a huge threat. There will be a tendency around the world to kind of effectively buy our way out of COVID by enormous investment and expenditure of fossil fuels to make ourselves feel better and be more comfortable and warm, and to take our eye off that ball. And I'm saying in a very big collective hour here. And in particular, public transport is potentially set back hugely by COVID. And I think that without public transport, without a complete shift away from the fuel driven, the fossil fuel driven private transport, we're not going to get there. So we do need to be very alert. Let's not be complacent about what follows COVID. I think that there are some real threats there, but of course there are opportunities, which is what we're all about, and we need to seize hold of that. And there needs to be a route map out of that too. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sunand. I'm going to move now on to Juliet Morgan, who's Head of Sustainable Development at British Land, and ask Juliet to comment in particular on the circular economy. Embracing the circular economy could have a massive impact in our ability to reach the zero carbon targets, but how are you adopting these principles at British Land? And what more do you think is needed from the industry to adopt this approach? So Juliet, over to you.
Thanks. Gosh, my brain's still a little bit on policy, actually. So if you'll forgive me, I'm just going to indulge one policy comment before answering the circular economy. And they kind of relate in that I know many of us across London have been looking at building with cross-laminated timber and the potential for timber to be a carbon store, if you like, in how we construct. And certainly we've seen France and America, both from a policy perspective, we are in the UK. And certainly across different London boroughs, we see differing attitudes towards risk, varying responses on fire regulations, insurances, consents. And I think there's a very tangible possibility for us to approach the potential for cross-laminated timber. And it's really nice to see Paradise Row get consented. We've just completed a scheme with War Thistleton up at 6 Alderman Road. So we have examples of timber-led buildings in London, and the industry opportunity, I think, is around potential collaboration around R&D, looking at very basic things like burn rate, because we end up having to make quite weird design decisions like covering timber in plasterboard or concrete to keep it fireproof. And so I think there's opportunities to learn from other countries and to apply that to policy here. And I hope you'll forgive me for just answering that before going into a circular economy answer, because it feels like a very tangible place that London can meet some of that agenda. From a circular economy perspective, I think one of the challenges we've seen has been around when you want to retain materials or recycle them, they end up being reduced to their lowest value use. So to give a really tangible example, something like stone in landscaping ends up being aggregated and going into road fills. So as an opportunity, we can try and retain value of the material in its existing form, or increase its value by reprocessing it to put it in its highest value, not driving down its value. I think circular economy approach is in its infancy at the moment. We employed circular economy approaches on our BREEAM Outstanding project at One Triton, and some of you will know, because we've talked about that building quite extensively, that with our partners at Arup and Lend-Lease and the design team across that building, we removed the facade, and the facade had been on for 20 years. And in order to essentially restore it, we had to build a factory. Rather than send it all back to Germany to get resealed and brought back here, we built a factory just outside the M25 to enable that to happen. When you have to build your own infrastructure, it tells you a lot about the infancy of the circular economy approach in this country. And so I think the opportunity for the industry is around materials passporting, EBIM, materials sharing, like Craigslist for materials, and then storage. So I've seen it within British Land projects, things that could be used elsewhere, but because there's a time lag between one project to the next project, materials go off into the world and end up not being retained for existing projects. So I kind of keep questioning, why isn't there a Craigslist for materials? And what that means is essentially a requirement for space. It's a requirement for jobs to process things in the circular economy. And I think there's a huge opportunity for local authorities to play in that with the space that they have and the jobs that could be created. One of the things that is worth being aware of is that whole life carbon impact comes from refurbishment. About 40% of it comes from refurbishment. And so there's a massive opportunity for circular economy within refurbishment. And the industry doesn't necessarily think about, fit out and refurb. We kind of classically head towards buildings and new builds. And so we worked with a company called Ripe to refurbish 338 Euston Road. And in doing that, we created jobs on site, reused existing fit out that had been left by a customer that was leaving. And we managed to retain about 78, nearly 80 kilos of carbon per metre squared, just by keeping what was there, giving it back to the market in a way that looked like new, but actually that material never left the building. It was refurbished on site and put back into the marketplace. And I think there's a huge opportunity for us to think about existing fit out. So I know that sort of slightly tees up Charlie quite nicely to think about long life and loose fit and the role of refurbishment. But yeah, those are some of my thoughts. I'd also say some of the challenges around deconstruction and the junctioning of materials. So I think there's a huge opportunity for designers and engineers to look at how, say, timber joints are executed on buildings, air gaps, all of those things, so that we don't just think about constructing the building, we think about demountability, storage, reassembly, and what those junctions look like over time. I'm sure there's a lovely pattern in there for somebody. That's my comments.
Thank you very much, Juliet. And yes, that tees us up nicely for Charlie Scott, who's Director of Waterman Structures at Waterman Group, who we've asked to give us some views on the thinking around long life, loose fit, low energy buildings, which was a concept first introduced, I think, in about the 1970s. And so we're interested to understand how much progress has been made there. And following on from Juliet's points, what needs to happen next to kind of develop that much further. So Charlie, I'll hand over to you.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you very much. Yes, I mean, if the report states very clearly that one of the #1 measures we have available to us to implement over the next 5 years is to look at whole life carbon assessments. And I'm sure all of you have shared the same frustration I have when running through a whole life carbon assessment, when you're factoring in the replacement of the facade, of all the services after 15 years, the facade after 20 or 30 years, and you're seeing large amounts of embodied carbon being factored into a 60-year life cycle assessment, purely because the elements of the building are failing or yielding or assumed to have reached the end of their service life. It's also consultants probably do. You're getting to a refurbishment of a building, and you're looking at it, and you get a facade consultant around, and they go, and I live in a 100-year-old building. The facades are as good as new. Doors, and you don't need to keep things away if we design them to last. Really are not disposable, that they last. In order to do that, it's worth thinking about why we currently demolish buildings, why we don't focus on refurbishing more of them, and then we can then use those lessons learned to really focus on how we design new buildings and how we repurpose existing buildings better. And on most jobs that end up being demolished, there's a myriad of different reasons that all add together to mean that a building, it becomes better and more cost effective to demolish that building. The structural lifespan might be coming to an end, but that's rare. Generally, it's a combination of water damage and roof finishes breaking down, the curtain walling all needing replacement, the MEP all needing to go, but it's normally mainly there's an obsolescence in its layout, how it's in flexibility, and how it can be reused. But when you add in the quality and the bits that are failing, a good analogy is probably an IKEA building. If you look at some of the facades we're detailing today, some of the buildings we're detailing today, because they have design life criteria of, say, 15 or 25 years for elements of the building, they are not designed to be long life durable. So if you were to take an analogy and say, if I wanted to have a piece of furniture for 15 years only, I would buy it here,
Charlie,
and buying a chipboard piece of furniture on the corner. After 15 years, all of the chipboard innards are going to start a bit loose. Sorry?
Charlie, we're experiencing a few sound issues. Perhaps if you just turn your camera off, and then hopefully we'll be able to catch.
Yeah. Let me just try going to. I'm just trying to stop my video. Is that any better?
That sounds better, thank you.
Good. Okay. So if we were going to buy a piece of IKEA furniture, we would expect it to yield and fail after about 15 years, and after 15 years, it would be worthless to us. If we were to look at the flip side of that and say, right, what if we were to buy a piece of mid-century classic furniture, and it was made out of solid wood, it was built to last, and we wanted it for the same 15-year period. After 15 years, if we no longer wanted it, rather than skipping it and throwing it away, we'd have something of value that we could sell on the open market. So designing buildings to be durable both creates value in the long term, it's a more sensible opportunity, but it also means you don't have to skip the bits that are unavailable. So we should really look at what buildings and what classes of buildings last, in order to design buildings that last, new buildings that last. And they tend to have some very similar attributes. They've got good bones and they're adaptable. So they all have this flexibility of space and generosity of space that means that they are able to be used by multiple occupiers in multiple ways. And they tend to be built with good detailing, good craftsmanship. They look of their time, but that time becomes a classic in its own right. And so they then have their own heritage and sense of belonging. So I think we need to apply a bit more rigor in how we design buildings. Look at every piece of the jigsaw puzzle. Maybe we need to stop designing facades that are reliant on moving silicon seals that will fail after 25 years and start to look at the kind of facades that a lot of architects have been championing anyway, where we're looking at punch windows, which should a window need replacing, you don't have to take the whole facade away. So looking at elemental maintenance strategies rather than wholesale maintenance and replacement strategies. Choosing materials wisely so that they don't degrade, that they can last a long time, and even going as far as to looking at how we design our common parts finishes so that we're not reliant on IKEA type toilets, that we're putting in colours that don't blemish and things that are built to last more than so that they don't tarnish and burnish, so that people won't want to replace them after 10, 15 years to crave that shiny and new. And then the final thing I think is MEP kit. And I'm not a service engineer, but we've got a service engineer within Waterman's, and we've looked at this a lot and thought we should move away from complicating our MEP systems and putting tech into buildings that really will have the risk of obsolescence and lots of embodied carbon in maintenance, and try and simplify our systems so that they work naturally. The Romans used to use convection and centrally tempered air, and their MEP systems lasted for hundreds of years. Maybe we could start to minimize the carbon in fit out as well as the carbon in buildings. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlie. Next we have Sarah Carey, who's the Executive Director of Place at the London Borough of Enfield. And we're going to ask Sarah to comment on the work that the borough is doing at Meridian Water, a major development scheme in that area, and how they're looking at both green infrastructure, but also energy production as well. So Sarah, over to you.
Thanks, Catherine. Just making, can you see me? I'm just double, yeah, thanks. Okay. I was really struck by what Sinan said about COVID as a sort of warning and the pandemic that we've been living through in terms of what it might, and kind of foreshadowing, because it's symptomatic of some of the same ways that we manage our society about what climate change could be like. And I do think it is a warning, but I think also particularly March and April and May were also a bit of a, in London at least, were a real window into what cities could be like with really good and a sort of differently, well, and an improvement in our green infrastructure and in the way that we get about cities. You know, it's hard to remember that time, but it was a time when London was actually quite quiet. It was really clear. You could tell the fact that the skies were cleaner and that you could hear the birds were singing, and particularly think places like parks became such a really key part of infrastructure for almost every Londoner. And it's one of the blessings of London that it is, while being a fairly dense city, has a really, really great provision of park infrastructure, not always the best in terms of nature, but in terms of just as a place for people to be and spend their time. It was absolutely incredible. And they became the gyms, the kind of living rooms, the pubs and the churches for quite a lot of people. And it was, I just think it's really helpful to reflect on how much the pandemic has driven home what makes a really good city can also be really good for nature and for climate mitigation and sort of management as well. And those things really go hand in hand. You asked in the briefing note about whether or not the residents in Enfield understood, or does the borough understand the benefits of green infrastructure? And Enfield has a really, really good history of water management through things like rain gardens, new wetlands in parks, and we're actually in the middle of deculverting one river, and at Meridian Water we've got 2 of those coming. And that's all about bringing first of all, improving water quality and improving biodiversity around water in a really big way, but also flood management in terms of climate change and people's access to nature. So that history of delivering that in North London is something we're bringing into Meridian Water, and we're kind of embracing that as part of it. And I would think that a lot of residents really in Enfield would understand that the benefits of those spaces at a even if it's just at a cursory level, like, oh, those wetlands are really nice, my kids have been there a couple of times, you know, they will understand the benefits of green infrastructure. At an officer level, and at what I would call a kind of advisory or kind of expert stakeholder level, it is the benefits of green infrastructure for climate and for human health are really strongly recognized. Our Health and Wellbeing Board, which is a corporate board with external stakeholders, so we've got senior NHS bodies on it, a lot of the adult social care groups, our public health teams, they are all pushing me more and more to be building more green infrastructure and to be doing more around tree planting and air quality. And linked to that, they're quite supportive of the low traffic neighborhoods, which I think have also been a really eye opener for a lot of Londoners about how amazing your streets can be when they're not full of cars. But that's, you know, so that there is a really strong push for that at a corporate level. And that's coming through in what we're doing at Meridian, where we've committed, alongside commitments around carbon neutrality and carbon positive in the long term, to have a significant increase in they're like 30% of the whole site to be open space. It's part of our vision for the whole development, to be park life on your doorstep, so that it's not like behind a fence over a road, but something that you sort of live in and have really great access to. And that dual benefit of human mental health and human health, as well as planetary health, is something that we've really embedded into the core master plan for Meridian. So I'm just going to summarize by saying I think I know that in the report that's published today, green infrastructure is sort of not the biggest thing to do. It's sort of down the list of things that would make the biggest difference in terms of climate. And I think that's probably right, but it's also really important to do for all the reasons why cities need to be great places for people to live in the long run. So I think you don't want people moving to the countryside and having to have a car and having to drive their children to school when they could, you know, just because they think cities aren't great places to be. So we need to champion that kind of green infrastructure as part of a really strong urban life, and it's possible, and I think London shows that. So
thank you very much, Sarah, that's brilliant. And our final panelist is Nathan Miller, who's principal at Elementa, and we've asked Nathan in particular to develop the point that Charlie was making around long life loose fit buildings, and particularly to talk about how we can properly calculate and reduce embodied carbon in our buildings. And we'd like to hear about how he's been approaching this, and also the work that Letty have been doing to support this work as well. So Nathan, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Catherine. And just to echo other people's comments on the report, it's a really nice summary and compendium of where we are as an industry at the moment, what we know and what we want to know in the future. So I think from my perspective, looking at embodied carbon within the industry, we can see from the number of consultations, working groups, company profiles, CapStats, advertising services out there. This is something that as an industry we're trying to tackle head on. We're trying to understand through research and development of tools, whether they be bespoke tools for our particular companies or our particular projects that we work on, whether that's as a consultant or whether that's as an end user, to really drive our thoughts and understanding of what we need to do as an industry and how we can go about it. I think the language and the communication that we're using within the industry is also evolving and is becoming more common. I think we had an issue historically where maybe we wanted to talk about the same thing, but we were talking about that topic in a completely different way, with a different narrative and a different language. And those, through the work of UKGBC, the World Green Building Council, the work that Letty has been doing, as well as a host of other people. We're starting to get refinement and an understanding of a common language around what we're talking about when we're discussing both operational carbon, but embodied carbon. And I think we're very much, operational carbon is probably seen as something which is more known and more understood. And the embodied carbon agenda gives us the opportunity to rapidly learn and grow to build that knowledge within the sector. From my perspective, what I find really refreshing is the collaborative approach. So people are across the industry, they're not being particularly precious about the information that they have. They're willing to share because this is such an important issue that we're all trying to tackle and to understand. So I can just say 2 examples that we've been working on at Elementa. One is to Charlie's point on MEP, looking specifically at MEP systems and embodied carbon, which is a huge unknown within the industry. And that's been almost a 3-year process now where we're starting to get that. We're working with CIBSE, and hopefully the output of that will be available publicly shortly. We're also thinking, need to consider knock-on consequences of operational or our zero carbon agenda, particularly looking at MEP systems with how we generate heat, how we generate cooling, with the development or the use of air source heat pumps. They come with refrigerants. How are those refrigerants going to impact the life and the embodied carbon of that building over its 60-year period? There's some careful selections and considerations that need to be made with regards to that. With regard to looking more at the traditional approach to structures, as Charlie's articulated, there's a number of different views and options that are available, particularly within the retrofit or refurbishment sector, which is, I'm still going to say, a pretty big unknown on how we're going to address that in a tangible and positive way. So just moving on to what Letty has been doing, which was one of the points that you've asked me to address. Obviously, hopefully most of the people on the call are aware of Letty. It's a collaborative group that's now got over 1,000 building experts and building designers involved. And in January of this year, published the Climate Emergency Design Guidelines and the Embodied Carbon Primer. And that's been downloaded 30,000 times in 120 countries. So we know that there's appetite for this knowledge and this understanding. And that really started a conversation, particularly around embodied carbon, where within Letty, there's now set up a number of work streams that are looking at a few issues which we've come to learn about as we delve into this, not least looking at procurement and specification. So how can we make sure that what we want to do as designers can be achieved by contractors and delivered? How the manufacturers can bring our design aspirations together. So really focusing on closing that gap. There's actually a survey open at the moment on that, which is going to close next week. So if there's any manufacturers on the call who are interested and want to get involved, please have a look at the Letty website and provide your information and guidance on that. One of the other key themes is, as we've spoken about, is retrofit. And we're also, the Royal We Letty is also looking at how we can gather a series of best practice case studies. So similar to what the NLA done, obviously, but looking more outside of a London focus. So what's happening internationally? How can we learn from other people on what they're doing within that whole life carbon sector? And that's also closely aligned with the Letty Pioneers Working Group as well. So within the initial retrofit, a lot of work is being considered in the residential sector. And again, there's going to be guidance and guidelines coming out on that over the next few weeks and months. And then also making sure that we have a top-down understanding of what our embodied carbon budget is. We've got an appreciation of what our energy budget is for a country. We know what contributions buildings need to take in terms of the available, currently available renewables, but how can we talk in that same language around embodied carbon? So that's another thing that Letty are also looking to address, to provide that knowledge and that understanding and the guidance to the industry. And then I think just finally looking to the future, there's going to be a consultation opening shortly, which is going to be looking at how we can deliver it, embodied carbon and whole life carbon guidance, across the whole of the sector, taking it on from the starting point that we had as Letty from 3 years ago to all of the amazing work that hundreds of people are doing at the moment and this year and moving on to the future. So really driving how we can continue to affect change, because it's through groups like Letty and the UK GBC and a whole host of other groups that are out there in that collaborative fashion that are really, really driving change. That we're seeing, obviously, as Juliet's spoken about, the drive that developers have to get the knowledge, get the understanding, and deliver something that they really, truly believe in. And as an industry, we need to continue to develop our understanding across the whole sector of from concept design to how we can deliver it, hand over the keys, how we can check that it's happening, as Charlie said, how we can make sure that after 15 years it's still going to be functioning as it wants to, how the design is going to have a minimal impact at 25 years, and then at 60 years at the end of its life through the circular economy. What is that product? How is that then going to be taken forward and used again? So for me, I think we're at the beginning of a really exciting and interesting journey. And as I said, one of the key things that I really enjoy and really happy about is the collaborative nature, that we're all moving towards the same goal with this. So for me, it's a refreshing change and something that I'm very much looking forward to continue being involved in.
Thank you very much. Now, we don't have a huge amount of time left. We have quite a lot of questions coming in, which is fantastic. So I'm just going to put a couple of those together. We've talked quite a lot about embodied carbon and developing much kind of longer life loose fit buildings, but I would like to ask the panel, should we also be thinking about buildings that are actually easier to take down, shorter life buildings perhaps, where we might be thinking quite differently about how we reuse those materials? And I wonder if I can start with Juliet.
Yeah, I think this is something I'm quite passionate about. I said something a bit unreasonable last week about how spending carbon today to be used in a demountable form in 100 or so year construction than any future generation will. And actually, buildings have become physical bank accounts. So the reason why we can't build short-term buildings is because they're either expensive to build, or we don't have the confidence in short-term materials. And so there isn't a business model around short-term buildings. And yet there's plenty of opportunity for what we would otherwise have referred to as meanwhile buildings. But I spent quite a lot of time out in Indonesia, and they seem to have no problem with kind of grown buildings. And I think there is an opportunity for us to think about natural materials and their shorter shelf life, and the potential for buildings that are much more aligned to how nature would build them, as opposed to how we build very hard things for a very long time. So just inviting that debate for business models for short-term, naturally based, maybe biodegradable materials, but much more biophilic in how they're designed.
Thank you. And Sunanda, we're getting a lot of support for your notion of an industry-wide roadmap. I wonder if you might be able to say perhaps a little bit more about how the industry can work together to develop a much clearer roadmap that brings this together, and the role that you see UK GBC playing in that as well.
I think it's a question of going out to engage with people who are engaging their own way or in different ways, and breaking down the silos, as the cliche has had it for so long. UK GBC made, I think, its best case by arguing for sustainability as a business proposition. That sustainability was not in contradiction to the need of running the world, business operations. So we made the business case for sustainability, if you like. Now that's something that the industry can unite on. That need not cause any ideological rifts. And I think the route to doing this is to say, we now know, all of us, we know we have to do this. There's no getting away from this. And if you don't do it, young people aren't going to come and work for your organization. Investors are going to pull out because you'll be regarded as a stranded asset. Your competitors will steal a march on you. And I think that's the way to approach it, that we actually collectively have a very amazing challenge to solve. It'll require innovation, it'll require the intelligence of various people. We consultants talk to each other, but the real innovation is happening in product manufacture, including the circular economy. So for example, one of the things we know about circular economy is that composite materials are a real problem because they cannot be deconstructed easily. And currently we have based a lot of our sustainability practices, such as composite windows, triple glazed composite windows with aluminium, timber, neoprene, glues, other materials bonded together, fantastically thermally broken and performing. But supposing we can't do that, what happens next? And we know that we can't do that because we can't reuse those windows. Or can we make a way of doing that? So you see, it's why you engage with people. It's because they have answers, and we need each other for the collective answer. And I think that there's a kind of tunnel vision that happens that we need to get out of. It's back to echo chambers and confirmation biases. We within this industry need to connect across much more. And the UK GBC has been trying hard to do it. We are going to try even harder to do that. And I think that without that, we won't get there.
Thank you, Sunand. That's a really great point to wrap up. We've just got over time, actually. So I'd like to thank all of our speakers so much for their fascinating contributions to the discussion today, and everyone for joining us as well. We're going to be developing these discussions over the next few months, and there are a number of topics that came up today that we'd love to delve into in much further detail. So just a reminder to go to the NLA website now, where you can download the report. Next Thursday, as part of London Climate Action Week, we're going to have a session looking at green financing solutions. And in early December, we'll be looking at some of the key projects in London that have developed some of the most environmentally ambitious approaches. So looking at what's behind those. Just a note that every day this month, we're also announcing winners of the New London Awards. Today, we're delighted to be announcing the winner of the Environmental Prize, which is sponsored by Hawley. And that's the Bun Hill 2 Energy Centre by Cullinan Studio and McGurk Chartered Architects for Islington Council and Transport for London. So many congratulations to them. Please look out for the video on our website and social channels, and watch out for the rest of the awards announcements this month. So thanks for joining us. Apologies, we've run over by a couple of minutes. We'll see you at the next event, and thank you all very much for coming.
Thank you.